Order. Order. The Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Trade Bill, consideration of Lord's message.
Now. I must draw the House's attention to the fact that financial privilege is engaged by Lord's Amendment 3E. If any Lord's Amendment engaging financial privilege is agreed to, I will cause the customary entry waiving Commons financial privilege to be entered in the Journal. We begin with the Government's motion to insist on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagree with Lord's Amendment E. I call Minister Greg Hands.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I beg to move that this House insists on its Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees to Lord's Amendment 3E. But let me start off, Madam Deputy Speaker. I heard my honourable friend, the member for Wealdon, and the apparent targeting of her by anybody in an intimidatory way, including foreign embassies, is totally unacceptable. And I will pass her comments directly to the Foreign Secretary. The Government takes very seriously indeed the intimidation of members of Parliament, as indeed do House authorities. I remember about 10 years ago in a meeting actually with Lord Alton and the North Korean Speaker, and I was shoved by a North Korean diplomat, and it was taken up very seriously by this House and by the Foreign Office at the time as well. But let me begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that the Government agrees with the principle that our proposed free trade agreement should be subject to the most searching parliamentary scrutiny in any instance where genocide may be occurring. The amendment passed by this House on February the 9th, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, delivers on that principle, and that is why the Government continues to support it today. This amendment ensures that the Government must put its position on record in writing in response to a Select Committee publication raising credible reports of genocide in a country with which we are proposing a bilateral free trade agreement. Where the Committee is not content with the response, it can insist on a parliamentary debate, and the Government will be obliged to make time for this. The amendment also affords the responsible Commons Select Committee the responsibility to draft the motion for debate. And that is a very powerful ability, Madam Deputy Speaker, for Parliament to stop any free trade agreement negotiations. This is a substantial concession, affording Parliament significant control over the process, and it has the Government's full support. On timing and effectiveness, to be very clear, the Government expects that its production of a report and the scheduling of any subsequent debate would be undertaken swiftly and within agreed timescales. I will note that in the amendment passed by the Lords, tabled by Lord Alton, peers have removed the role that they had previously proposed for the High Court. Honourable members will recall that it is the Government's long-standing position that the determination of genocide is a matter for a competent court. As I have previously made clear, competent courts include relevant international courts and domestic criminal courts. Let me be clear on this point. We are not changing settled government policy here. But likewise, in supporting the amendment from the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, we are not asking Parliament to make a determination on whether genocide has occurred. We are instead supporting a process that guarantees scrutiny and debate where Parliament has established for itself that credible reports of genocide exist. This is not the same as a judicial finding, nor is it intended to be. It is both a lower bar and swifter to establish credible reports than it is to prove genocide itself. And this leads to a debate on a substantive motion. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe this is the right way forward. This brings me to the latest amendment passed by a former Liberal MP, Lord Alton, in the other place, which seeks to give a quasi-judicial role to an ad hoc parliamentary judicial committee to make preliminary determinations of genocide. Lord Alton proposes this ad hoc committee would comprise 5 members from either House, where those members have all held, and I quote from the amendment, high judicial office. Now, it should be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this approach is problematic. First, because it is in conflict with the Government's settled policy. Competent courts must make determinations on genocide, not parliamentary committees. Of course.
I don't pretend to expertise on this particular controversy, but I do recall that when it was last debated, one of the objections being made was the fact that if an outside court were to make the determination, that would be taking power away from this Parliament. Now the government seems to be objecting to parliamentarians making this determination, even though they are highly qualified by dint of being former judges. That seems to me a little bit cake-and-eat-it situation.
Thank you, and I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, because there is clearly areas of possible confusion in this space. So let me be absolutely clear. The objection from the government was the High Court determining that there be a debate in Parliament. That is the crucial difference between the previous Alton Amendment and our objections to this one. It isn't about where genocide is determined. It is about whether the court dictates the proceedings of Parliament. So Lord Alton proposes that the High Judicial Office. It should be clear that this approach is problematic. First, because it is in conflict with the government's settled policy. As I've said, giving such a power to an ad hoc parliamentary judicial committee would represent a fundamental constitutional reform. It would blur the distinction between courts and Parliament and upset the separation of powers, and so the government cannot support it. Honourable members should also note that... yes, I will. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend and for his comments earlier on. I'm slightly anxious that my right honourable friend may be misrepresenting a situation at the dispatch box. Unintentionally. Unintentionally. Forgive me. The quasi-judicial has a meaning in law. What the Alton Amendment proposes is that members of the House of Lords who were previously judges are able to review any decision that the House of Commons Select Committee makes. It is not a court. It is just a select committee in the House of Lords. What has my minister got to fear?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. But it is clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the definition in the amendment of those who have held high judicial office will, in the view of the government, inevitably confer quasi-judicial status on that committee. By definition, it is 5 members who have held high judicial office. It would be very difficult not to have the impression that that is operating in a quasi-judicial manner. I'm going to make a little bit more progress. There's very limited time. I'm going to make a bit more progress. So let me deal with this matter of engaging financial privilege. When an amendment is designated as engaging Commons financial privilege, the government is procedurally required to provide this as the reason if disagreeing to the motion, although our reasons for disagreeing are much broader. As I've just set out, financial privilege is sufficient reason in itself to deem the amendment disagreed to. The designation of Lord's amendments as engaging financial privilege is an impartial process determined by the Speaker on the advice of House authorities. We have listened closely to debates, Madam Deputy Speaker, in both this House and the other place, and we take very seriously the issue of genocide and the passions it has rightly stirred on all sides. Consequently, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can announce from this dispatch box today that the government is willing to work with Parliament and relevant select committee chairs should they choose to establish new joint committees or subcommittees, or to engage the expertise of former members of the judiciary in considering reports of genocide in the context of our proposed free trade agreements. For example, the membership of a new joint committee could be made up of members of both select committees. The relevant Lords Committee would have cross-bench membership, and it would be possible for the convener to ensure that at least one of these members were an ex-judge. This is the established process that is followed for other committees, which have been chaired by ex-law lords. In addition, with the agreement of the usual channels, it would be possible for additional members with relevant expertise to be appointed to the Joint Committee, as is the case with the Lords Subcommittee on the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Joint Committee would also be able to take evidence from other former members of the judiciary if desired. I'm going to make more progress. In any case, it is not necessary to set this out in legislation. And in fact, I would be surprised if honourable members voted today to bind themselves in this way, setting out the procedures of a parliamentary subcommittee in legislation. Parliament is free to amend its standing orders to set up committees and subcommittees as it chooses. and to take evidence from those with legal expertise if it deems this to be necessary. Legislating for these matters would only serve to remove flexibility from both Parliament and Government should the issue of genocide, as it pertains to trade, arise in future. A more nimble and flexible approach may be necessary depending on the context. The precise details remain to be worked out by Parliament quite properly, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I hope it will be clear from what I have said today that the Government is supportive of working with honourable members on this issue and is committed to doing so in line with the process previously agreed to by this House on the 9th of February. But we regret, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a very limited time in this debate. We cannot support the creation of a parliamentary judicial committee as envisaged in Lord Alton's amendment, as it blurs the distinction between legislative and judicial and runs contrary to government policy, that it is for competent courts to make determinations of genocide. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to highlight the statement made by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, made on sanctions that the Government will be undertaking earlier today. I hope that this is another illustration of the Government's commitment in this very important area, taking tough action on China in Xinjiang with Magnitsky sanctions taken in conjunction with our international allies. In light of what I have said today, I hope that honourable members will support Amendments 3C and 3D.
First of all, to inform the House that the Speaker has selected the amendment in the name of Nusrat Ghani. The question is that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment E. Before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, just to inform the House as well that there will be a 3-minute limit on speeches for backbenchers. There is the countdown clock for those in the chamber, and for those participating virtually, it will be on the screens. Shadow Secretary of State Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. By my calculations, it's been 3 years, 2 months and 2 weeks since this House first debated the Government's proposed trade bill. So if today's debate proves to be the final one in a long, drawn-out bill, then it does seem an appropriate time to thank all members of both houses, all the parliamentary clerks and all the officials in the Department for International Trade who have contributed to its passage. Madam Deputy Speaker, looking back at the very first day of the debate in January 2018, I was struck by 2 things that were said by the Right Honourable Member for North Somerset, the then Secretary of State, which seemed very prescient in retrospect. The first was, and I quote, "Trade is an issue that transcends party politics." And time and again over the past 3 years, we have seen that to be the case, as members from all sides of the House have campaigned together on different issues from farming standards to online harms. It seems fitting, after more than 3 years, that we should have been left with one final issue to resolve. And that is that where cross-party consensus about where we stand as a Parliament and what we believe in as a country will be the most important of all. And it relates to the second thing that the former Secretary of State said 3 years ago, which I believe is equally relevant today. He said, and I quote, "Trade is not only about self-interested commercial gain." For me, that simple statement of principle goes to the heart of the debate that we have had in recent months, and especially in the last week, in relation to human rights and trade. I think that it goes to the heart of the decision that we have to take today in relation to the Alton Amendment, to the Genocide Amendment. And I know that there are some people, Madam Deputy Speaker, who believe that the choices that we make as a country on who to sign trade deals with should be entirely dictated by our commercial interests, and that considerations about human rights should be dealt with entirely separately. But there is another point of view, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I believe is shared by the majority of people in this country and by the majority of MPs in this House, which is simply this: that there is a line that needs to be drawn, that there are certain countries whose crimes are so great that they cannot simply be ignored, on the basis of commercial self-interest, and that Britain as a country must be willing to say no to trade deals with countries that cross that line. The Alton Amendment, as advanced today by the member for Wealdon, seeks to draw that line by giving Parliament the power to debate whether Britain should sign any form of bilateral trade or investment deal with a government held responsible for genocide by our country's most experienced judges. And whether members in this House decide to support that amendment today should have nothing to do with what party they represent. It should have nothing to do with the long overdue sanctions against Chinese officials announced by the Foreign Secretary earlier today. And with all due respect to the Minister of State, it should have nothing to do with the points of constitutional precedence that he made in his opening speech. Whether we support the Alton Amendment should only come down to the fundamental question, which is one that we need to all ask ourselves. Should Britain be willing to sign trade agreements with governments who are committing genocide? Should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with governments which are engaging in torture, mass detention, slave labour, organ harvesting, and non-judicial executions, not on an isolated basis but on an industrial scale, against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang? Should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with a government which is separating hundreds of thousands of children from their parents and re-educating them in different languages, religion and history in an attempt to wipe the Uyghur culture off the Chinese map? And should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with a government that is carrying out the systematic sexual abuse, rape and sterilisation of hundreds of thousands of women in Xinjiang in an attempt to guarantee that this current generation of Uyghur children is the last? I cannot see how anyone in this House can read the evidence of those crimes which are being committed against the Uyghurs and think that a potential trade or investment deal with China can be considered only on its commercial merits and not on the basis of morality. That is surely where we need to draw the line, and that is what the Alton Amendment seeks to do, and that is why I urge members on all sides of this House to look into their souls this afternoon, to vote with their conscience, and to make clear that this is the line that Britain is not prepared to cross.
I think she's finished.
Sorry, I thought you were giving way.
No, I've sat down. I've finished. Sorry, I hadn't seen your button. Otherwise, I would have.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to continue the debate that has been going on amongst us about what actually constitutes a fair and reasonable settlement with the government. Now, I simply say that, first of all, I want to start by moving the amendment standing in my honourable friends from Wealdon's name and that of myself and my honourable friend for East Worthing and Shoreham. And I do that because I think that the government's got itself twisted up in knots on this, I have to tell him, and I think he knows that. He knows very well that when this amendment was first put through the Lords, I spoke to a number of ministers, and I must say, reaction from each of the ministers was, don't think there's a problem here. You've met our red lines, and this is a committee in the Lords. Suddenly, late in the day, they discovered this phenomenal red line called quasi-judicial. Can I just say, on the definition the government has given us today, quasi-judicial can be applied to any select committee in the House of Commons. It can be applied to any committee. Here is what a quasi-judicial committee, in legal terms, is defined as. Let me just give it to him. Its definition of quasi-judicial is a proceeding conducted by an administrative or executive official. Now, this is important because Parliament does not have any of those on its committees. And this is the important point. Parliament is separate from the executive, so it does not apply to Parliament. The second thing, he knows very well, by the way, that we have allowed in this amendment the government to set the terms of how that will sit, the balance of evidence, and the kind of peers that would sit in there, which is to do with the judiciary. My honourable want to give.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I disagree with me that it's very difficult to see a position that the Minister would actually agree to. And yet, in the Lords, they have changed and tried to compromise so often. And does he agree with me that under the terms of the government's own amendment to this bill, the Uyghurs do not come under the remit and therefore would have no protection from this House?
Compared to everybody else.
Yeah, I'm grateful. My honourable friend knows very well that the problem is this amendment from the Lords incorporates the Neil Amendment, the original Neil Amendment. It incorporates it in its entirety. It makes two adjustments. And this is really on paragraphs 2A, where it's quite clear two things happen as a result of that. Number one, there are already trade arrangements with China, but they're pushed aside in this. It can only be an FTA, and it's a prospective one. And that means that the Uyghurs are not going to get in front of the Select Committee at all. The second thing, which is very important, is it also opens the door, because of the definition, to any state activist who has nothing to do with the authority in that state. Those are the two things. All QCs have seen this straight away and accepted this is a major problem. So we've dealt with that, made it a better arrangement, and added the committee. The second thing, added the legal committee. And the second point about this is, it seems to me that the government simply doesn't want to have these judges involved. And then they go to the other twist, which is, well, we'll have a judge if you want on one of the select committees. Well, what does that do? Doesn't that make it now apparently another quasi-judicial opening? The truth is, it's really, if he doesn't mind me saying so, a bit sad that the government couldn't have accepted this amendment. There was no need for us to be here today voting on this. This was a major compromise, and it would have settled everything. And therefore I say to my right honourable friend, who he knows I have huge respect for him in the job that he has to do right now, but I simply say we had a chance and have a chance tonight to send a message following a very good statement by the Foreign Secretary that we simply won't put up with this. We're not frightened of finding that this is genocide, and we're not frightened of saying it from the steepletops. We know that what we have to do is stand up for those who have no voice. This chamber has a history of doing that. It has an opportunity tonight to do that, and I'm sorry that my government, I hugely respect, doesn't think that they can do it. I urge people to vote tonight for this particular Lord's Amendment.
We now go to the SNP spokesperson, Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an aside, I notice the countdown timer is running on this. I assume I get the front bench privilege for the speech.
The Honourable Gentleman certainly does, so it would be a mistake if the countdown was running. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the original intent of the Lord's Amendment on genocide for this bill was to bind the government. It was to bind the government, to ensure that its trade policy was not actively engaging in propping up the economy of a country that was committing genocide. This is something that these benches regarded as being reflective of the bare minimum standards of what should be our commitments to human rights and to global citizenship. Madam Deputy Speaker, I say bare minimum because there should be much more power given to that commitment than was contained even in that amendment. What we should see is an approach along the lines of a comprehensive cross-departmental strategy aimed at preventing atrocities and binding both the behaviour and intent of government action to such commitments. The original amendment from Lord Alton was in itself a bit hingham-tringham. However, despite the fact that it still wasn't nearly strong enough, we supported it, as it was at least a step in the right direction. Madam Deputy Speaker, make no mistake, as we stand here today in this debate on the text of the bill before us, we are now very far away from even that place. Any idea that we're actively debating accountability to human rights, even on the terms originally intended, is blown apart by the very government texts this House is now considering. The government has maintained that it does not need the law to reflect its commitments to human rights, that they wouldn't do anything to compromise it. Further, that its so-called compromise amendment facilitates a new level of commitment. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, as soon as one minister pours honey in the public's ears, another drops the mask and lets slip the poisonous truth that condemns those warm words as cozenage. It is clear from the remarks of the Foreign Secretary, who is also the de facto Deputy Prime Minister, that there is absolutely no substance to the government's rhetoric on being champions for human rights at every turn, but that shamefully it is willing to actively pursue an unethical trade policy. If there was ever any doubt about the hollowness to the maxim of global Britain, it's rung out loud and clear in the Foreign Secretary's words. The amendment backed by the government is, of course, completely inadequate in checking its actions. It binds them to naught, and it is crystal clear that the government, in reality, would rather not be subject to any moral position or restriction on its trade policy. In this bill, the government could have committed to maintaining current consumer and labour standards. It turned this chance down, and the public should ask the question, why? Well, the answer is because they are all too willing and ready to sacrifice them to get a deal. Any deal. Anyone naive enough to think this isn't the case should look at what is happening with the NHS and human rights. The government could have taken the opportunity to ensure the protection of all aspects of the NHS from private foreign procurement, but it turned the chance down. Why? Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a sign of the times, it's been busy allowing the sale of NHS GP practices to US companies, with Centene Corp, the US health insurance giant, quietly assuming control of the care of 500,000 patients in recent weeks. Donald Trump mercifully may be gone, but few will forget a rare moment of honesty with him confirming that the NHS is on the table in a US-UK trade deal. And we all know it very much still is. His Tory cohorts are still here, and they have earned zero trust over their deeds and actions. Now we see the government looking to shirk its commitments on matching its trade policy to our values in protecting human rights. Why? Again, because of the words of the Foreign Secretary, we know exactly why. The cat is not only out of the bag, it is running feral to alert the world to the fact that to the UK, human rights abuses won't matter. This government will forgive almost anything in its haste to get a deal. Any deal. It turned down the chance to do the right thing. Behind the scenes, we can hear loudly and clearly that this does not matter to the government. Publicly, we can see the government retreating on its legally binding manifesto commitment to international aid spending. This amendment does not do justice to the intentions of the members across all parties that have sought to meet this commitment head-on. The government's empty words on global Britain do not have any bearing on virtually any aspect of its policy in protecting the most vulnerable around the world, determining any notion of responsibility in who the UK sells arms to, or now apparently who we trade with. If this weren't so serious, it would be laughable that this government is trying to rest on laurels that simply don't exist. They should wake up to the reality that the UK's moral standing is already badly damaged. This makes matters worse, and by its actions tonight, this government has done nothing to repair it, but is solely responsible for bringing it into such disrepute. On a day when the UK Food and Drink Federation has published details of exports to the EU of salmon, beef, pork and cheese being savaged by over 80% in the case of salmon, 98%, effectively an utter wipeout of a major Scottish export, yet another poll shows that the people of Scotland have had enough of this attitude, confirming as it does majority support for independence, as does the long-term poll tracking. They are seeing for themselves the twin economic and moral vacuum being created by this Tory government. Looking at this shameful situation, they know that to protect our international trade reputation and to be representative for global citizenship in the way that they want, the only way to achieve that is by Scotland once again joining the international community as an independent nation. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The original question was that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 3E, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Dr Liam Fox.
Madam Deputy Speaker, following that previous intervention, I hope I can return to the subject that we're discussing today. Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for her generous words and her accurate quotation. None of us actually believed the process would take quite as long as it did when we began. And can I say to my honourable friend, the member for Wealdon, relating to the point of order she raised about this, I am extremely distressed that she should feel frightened by the intervention of a foreign power in her actions in the House of Commons. But given the level of cyber intrusion in the United Kingdom in general, is something perhaps we should all be afraid of. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are three brief reasons why I want to support the Government's position exactly as I've set out before. First of all, I don't believe that we should make generic law on the basis of specific cases. The history of our legislation is littered with victims of unintended consequence, which I think comes when we undertake that particular action. I believe we should have specific actions for specific issues, such as set out by the Foreign Secretary today in the atrocious way that the Chinese government treats the Uyghurs. And I think that that's the appropriate way to proceed. Secondly, I believe that the House can vote down any free trade agreement through the CRAG process. And if we were to have a preferential free trade agreement that gave greater access to China, to the United Kingdom market, than exists under WTO regulations, we already have the ability to block it. I don't believe, for a range of different reasons, that we're likely to see that any time soon. Certainly, the trade conditions, never mind the human rights conditions, I think would create conditions where that was not going to happen. And thirdly, I do not believe we should restrict the right of the elected government and the House of Commons to implement policies on which they were elected. And it's the point of principle, I'm afraid, that I raised in every single debate that we've had on this so far. Whether it's an unelected Lords Committee of senior judges or the courts themselves, we should want to reject, as the House of Commons, unwarranted intrusion into the rights of democratically elected governments to implement the policies on which they have been elected. And I don't think that we in this House should put down limits on what they can do, and I do not believe, even more, that we should allow elements outside the House of Commons to do so. I believe it sets a constitutional precedent that, for whatever good reasons we would consider these changes today, we would come to regret over time.
Number 6 withdrawn. So, Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know in this place that we should recognise win, so I'm grateful that the Government have accepted the principle that it cannot be unaccountable when negotiating trade deals with genocidal states. That is the proposition with the Government's Neil Amendment. That we have banked. But the proposed Government amendment excludes the Uyghur, which makes no sense considering the very forceful statement made by the Foreign Secretary just a few hours ago. The Foreign Secretary's statement today I welcomed, especially the sanctions. We've also banked that, but the message we're sending now by denying the Genocide Amendment to tyrannical states is that we have a two-tier genocide system, one which the Uyghur are excluded from. In case it has to be said, Madam Deputy Speaker, I join my colleague for Chingford and Wood Green and East Worthing by formally moving my motion on the order paper today to agree with the Alton Amendment, formerly known as a Genocide Amendment. I regret I cannot support the Government's amendment because it responds to the Uyghur crisis by producing an amendment which excludes them. The Government amendment only applies to countries which are formally negotiating a free trade agreement. The Genocide Amendment excludes the Uyghur. Considering everything that's been said today, I really think this is a shameful way to deal with our international and national responsibilities and fundamentally sends a message that we have a two-tier system in place. I was trying to explain this to my daughter earlier on this morning, and it's like landing a position such as the Government putting together a call for evidence on the violence against women and girls and saying we're not going to allow women and girls to give evidence. Let me explain. Uyghur women who are forcing sterilisations at a rate that makes The Handmaid's Tale seem a fairy tale, with a birth rate drop of 84%, a clear marker of genocide, we are saying to Uyghur women, you don't matter. Anyone else but you can present to the Select Committee.
My honourable friend, good way.
Oh, indeed.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend because not only does the Government's version of legislation not cater for the Uyghurs at all, but this afternoon's announcement, welcome though it was as an extra step, doesn't include Chen Guangzhou, who, as she knows, is the chief of the Communist Party in Xinjiang, who is the author and architect of some of these genocidal activities going on and needs to be held to account.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, which is why I think it's so important we back the Genocide Amendment. We give teeth to all the statements made in the House. I know that the President of the World Uyghur Congress has written to many members and said, we do not understand why the UK government would treat us like this, he means the Uyghur, bringing forward a proposal which excludes us in response to a campaign which is all about the suffering of our people. I am grateful for how far the government has moved, but we moved too. I just wanted to ensure the Uyghur people were treated equally to everybody else facing a similar sort of plight. Today we have a historical vote on a simple question. Do we apply genocide policy equal to all people, or do we have a two-tier genocide policy now? The Board of Deputies recently wrote, "We are always hesitant, extremely hesitant, to consider the comparisons with the Holocaust and notice similarities of what's happening in China to Nazi Germany. By backing the genocide amendments, we can act when we say never again, by allowing the Uyghur to be included, not excluded, from the government motion." I hope colleagues will join me in the I lobby with a genocide amendment, which really just gives further teeth to the government's earlier sanctions and tidies up a little flaw in the government's amendment which excludes the Uyghur. We cannot have a two-tier genocide process. We move so forward, let's not fall at the last hurdle. And we must and we can be on the right side of history by voting for the genocide amendment.
Yeah.
We now go to Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I support the motion tabled by the member for Wealden and very much appreciate the opportunity this evening for what is essentially a straight vote on the Alton Amendment, which is particularly welcome in light of the procedural shenanigans that prevented this last time. I want to call out the rank hypocrisy of the government in its approach to the whole issue of determining whether a genocide is taking place. They have always ducked the question as to whether the Chinese regime is committing genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang by saying that the determination of genocide is a judicial decision and not a political one. It is something that requires legal determination. The Prime Minister said this when he was the Foreign Secretary, answering Foreign Office questions in November 2017, when he said, and I quote, "Genocide is a strict legal term and we hesitate to deploy it without a proper judicial decision." In fairness, that has been the position of successive governments. But this government knows that there is no international mechanism that will enable a legal determination on genocide against the Uyghurs because China will use its veto. None of the options for competent courts under international law are viable. And now that there is a way forward in a domestic setting with the new Alton Amendment, which in itself is a significant compromise, we are no longer considering a role for the High Court, but one for former senior judges in the House of Lords to make a determination on genocide. The government now say that they are happy to leave this issue to parliamentary select committees instead. This is unconscionable, unacceptable, breathtaking hypocrisy, and the House should take a stand against it today. If the government is acting in good faith, then I cannot think of any reason why they will not accept a role for the Judges Panel in the House of Lords as per the Alton Amendment. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, we all have a fundamental judgment to make today. It has nothing to do with constitutional precedent or any other separate actions that the government has announced today, in particular its welcome, though long overdue, decisions in relation to deploying the Magnitsky sanctions regime. It is simply today whether we draw a line in the sand and say that Britain must not do trade deals with countries that commit genocide. That is the only issue that is at stake here today, and that is why I urge all members to vote for the Alton Amendment this evening.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to start by commending the Department for Trade for their fantastic work in continuing to secure free trade agreements around the world. Last week, I hosted a webinar on exporting in partnership with the Department and my right honourable friend, the member for Wakefield. And it was inspiring to hear of the opportunities that our small and medium-sized businesses were taking in boosting skills and jobs in our local areas. With around 6.5 million UK jobs supported by UK exports, it's vital we continue to support and encourage businesses to export, which will help drive a jobs-led recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that this bill before us updates and builds upon our existing continuity trading relationship that form part of our membership with the EU. I particularly welcome the WTO's agreement on government procurement, which will secure access for UK businesses to overseas procurement opportunities worth £1.3 trillion per year. And I also welcome the new Trade Remedies Authority, which will enable Britain to secure the benefits of freedom while providing a safety net for domestic industries. Madam Deputy Speaker, this country leads the way in making the case for human rights, as proven by my right honourable friend, the member for Esher and Walton's statement this afternoon, and we have not embraced an independent trading policy to do otherwise. So our trading policy must reflect our human rights priorities in a way that is both practical and coherent with our Constitution. Firstly, in order to work effectively, the determination of matters of genocide needs to be practical and follow established methods. As a result, it is perfectly reasonable for this judgment to rest with the competent courts, which include domestic criminal courts and relevant international courts, rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. We all support the objective of upholding human rights. It is a question of how we achieve that best in practice. As my right honourable friend, the member for Chelsea and Fulham, already stated, the government has listened and given assurance that Parliament and Select Committee chairs will be part of the process to establish new joint committees or subcommittees or bringing in the expertise of former members of the judiciary. Amendments proposed by the other place, however, would create a wrecking ball situation in which the High Court would fundamentally challenge a royal prerogative. In my view, such a move will undermine our confidence in Parliament. Brexit was about strengthening this voice that Parliament has. This bill and the amendment made by my right honourable friend, the member for Chislehurst, gives a clear role for Parliament to act quickly and decisively in human rights situations, whilst also seizing the new global opportunities ahead.
Video link to Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade pointed out earlier, we have had many debates in this place about this trade bill, but today there is only one question before us, and that is, should the UK have trade deals, have agreements with countries that practice genocide on their own peoples? It seems very, very clear to me and to my fellow members of the Liberal Democrats that we need to grab this opportunity as it's presented to us here today to make that very, very clear statement. We welcome the statement by the Foreign Secretary earlier today about the Magnitsky sanctions, but we absolutely must follow that up and make it so clear in everything that we do that we do not tolerate genocide in any shape or form. So the Liberal Democrats remain unflinching in our support of Lord Alton's amendment, and we welcome the fact that their lordships have once again returned this bill to the Commons with this amendment. And I urge the government to listen to all the cross-party voices on this issue and allow the amendment to stand. Time is short, so I will not rehearse all the reasons why this genocide amendment is so necessary in combating the actions of the regimes against their own people, such as we are currently seeing against the Uyghurs in China at this very moment. It continues to baffle me that this government, which fought so hard for the rights of the UK to agree its own trade deals, has so little to say about how it plans to use that power. It has resisted calls from across the House to use the power of our trade deals to demand environmental, social or human rights improvements from our trading partners. How can we ensure that our goods and services will not be cheaply traded away? The government will not even allow this amendment. The government's objections to the original amendment have been ably addressed by their lordships, and we will be voting for this amendment tabled by a member for Wealden this evening. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would have no hesitation in voting against a trade deal with a state that commits genocide. I'd also have no hesitation in voting against a trade deal with a state which has oppressive behaviours and conduct which fall short of the legal definition of genocide. But either way, those are political decisions and should be taken here, and therefore we need a political process to deal with those. And that's why, despite the changes, there still remain difficulties with the latest iteration that comes back from their lordships. And the problem is given away actually by the language, which was recognised perhaps by the Shadow Secretary of State when she referred to a finding by our country's most experienced judges. And that's actually the rub of the wording of the amendment. When it talks in terms of a parliamentary judicial committee, when it talks in terms of preliminary determination, later defined as a public finding, those are the languages of courts rather than of parliaments. And the game is further revealed, or the intention is further revealed, more accurately, by Clause 10, subsection A, subsection 1, which specify the procedure by which judges may be appointed to the Parliamentary Judicial Committee. But, of course, that's constitutionally inaccurate, leave behind anything else. Because once former members of the judiciary sit in the other place, they sit there as former members, no longer as judges. They have ceased their judicial function. To pass this amendment would actually be constitutionally illiterate on its current wording. And whilst the expertise of the former members of the judiciary is very great and very welcome, it's surely objectionable in principle to create a parliamentary committee upon only which one class of member of either house can serve and be cut by reference purely to their previous occupation. Secondly, it seems to me undesirable that by statute we shall seek to circumscribe so closely both the membership of a committee of either house or the proceedings by which such a committee operates, which normally should be a matter for standing orders. And I would have thought that was much the better way by which to go. Time is very... I'll give way to the Secretary of State since I referred to her speech, but then I'm speaking.
Something that's always concerned me about the Right Honourable Gentleman's amendment, though, is that he refers... It's for select committees to make decisions about whether or not there has been genocide, but we've heard from the chairs of the select committees that would be the primary candidates who've all said that they don't think that they're up to it and they don't feel that they have sufficient experience and that it would be the sort of thing that someone with judicial experience would be able to do better.
Then, of course, they would lead the Right Honourable Lady back into the constitutional problem that was recognised and rejected by this House on the previous occasion with the first version of the Alton Amendment. And secondly, what I posit the better way forward is this, and that's to use the standing orders of this House to set up a joint committee of both Houses to scrutinise the matter. And that could, of course, from the crossbench members of the other House, include members of the House of Lords with former judicial experience, but they will be there as members of the House, not as former judges, and that's their proper constitutional position. And none of them have sought to suggest that they will be doing so otherwise, very correctly. I'm sorry, time presses. I've given way once, and it wouldn't be fair upon other people with respect. I hope that when the Minister comes to respond to the debate, he will make clear that the Government would facilitate the bringing forward of motions to enable the establishment of such a joint committee of both Houses, and I hope very much then that members of the other place with high judicial experience might well lend their expertise to that. The obvious precedent is the work of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, ably chaired by the Right Honourable Lady and Member for Camberwell and Peckham. Over the years, that has established a very high reputation for its rigour of scrutiny, the quality of its decision-making and the respect in which it is held. It's inconceivable that such a committee would be ignored by any government on an issue as important and significant as potential genocide by a potential trading partner. I'd urge the government to take that as the right way forward, rather than falling into a well-intended, totally well-intended, but nonetheless undesirable constitutional trap of yet again this latest iteration.
Get a minute.
Of the amendment.
Have you given way? Or...
I thought he'd just go. I'm grateful to help him. Can I just say to him, he, of course, is making a speech which contradicts government position right now, because, of course, the government itself does not believe that what this House or a joint House would do is decide that genocide has taken place. So he, in a sense, is quite a long way towards our amendment.
I fear my right honourable friend misunderstands, I'm sure inadvertently, because in fact my stance is entirely consistent with that of the government, because it would be for the select committees to refer the matter to the joint committee, and that would then take a view as to whether potentially genocide had been taken place, but then that would be a matter which informed the House ultimately as to whether or not it decided to go through with the signing off of a trade agreement. And of course, even under the Cragg process, this House has controls over that matter. So there is actually, with respect to my right honourable friend, no contradiction at all. The nonsense would actually be to have a situation where you seek to create, however well intended, a quasi-court, I won't say quasi-judicial, a quasi-court in the other place through the language of this amendment. That actually would do, I suspect, more harm than the good that is intended by it. And I hope, if the government will make clear their intentions to facilitate the setting up of a joint committee, we have a better and altogether more suitable resolution.
Video link to Mari Rimmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sorry, I seem to have gone.
I think we can hear the Honourable Lady. She wants to continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Genocide is the most horrific act of barbarity that human beings are capable of. In 20 years' time, I probably will not be around, but most members will be. By then, the true horrors of what the Chinese regime is doing in Xinjiang will be known by all. Each member of this House will want to look back with the knowledge that when presented with the opportunity to do something, they took it. When we hear the word genocide, we think of the Nazi concentration camps, gas chambers, and the horrors of the Holocaust. What is happening in Xinjiang is more subtle. It is genocide by stealth, forced sterilisation, the forcible transfer of children, and forced labour camps, all of a specific ethnic group. In this case, it is the Uyghurs. In this case, it is genocide. The Genocide Amendment will help us to prevent our nation being complicit with genocidal regimes. The status quo of determining genocide is not good enough. It is foolish to rely on the International Criminal Court. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China will veto any trial. Imagine a murder suspect vetoing their own trial. The situation is ludicrous. It's now been 75 years since the Nuremberg trials. In that time, our country has never succeeded in recognising genocide while it was happening. This is our chance to do it. In January, I joined with members across this House to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to say never again to genocide. Now is the time to take action, to put those words into practice. I appeal to all members of this House to consider your vote carefully and to vote with your conscience. In years to come, no member wants to look back with regret. Do not be party to this Parliament looking the other way. Thank you.
It's withdrawn, so we go to Geraint Davis.
Hello?
Geraint Davis, do go ahead.
Sorry about that, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tonight, the government has to decide whether it allows Parliament to intervene in terms of trade deals, specifically in relation to genocide. And we've all heard the stories about mass rape, concentration camps, people unable to have babies, brainwashing, cultural genocide. And the issue here is whether Parliament is given the ability, on the basis of evidence, to restrict trade in these situations. Now, last time, of course, we had a Lord's Amendment which said that the courts should provide the evidence, decide whether there's conclusive evidence of genocide, and then we, the politicians in Parliament, would decide what we did about it, whether we restricted trade or not. It was said that those weren't competent courts. Of course, if you say competent courts are only international courts, then China can veto them, and it defeats the object. It was said that that was judicial interference in Parliament, when of course it wasn't. And now the Lords have come out with a new amendment that says, fair enough, if that's the way you see it, we'll have a committee making decisions on the basis of, concrete evidence, judicially prepared, in essence. And now the government is saying, oh, well, you can't do that, because that's the judiciary interfering with Parliament. Well, I mean, you can't have it both ways. And it does seem, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is, in essence, an intentional evasion by the government to prevent Parliament in its, solemn duty to defend our intrinsic values. And I certainly don't accept the point made by the man for North Somerset that the government's somehow got some sort of mandate to muzzle debate and to blur scrutiny. We must be free to debate and decide based on the evidence. The government must explain what they're doing if trade continues with perpetrators of genocide. And we should know, yes, the economic costs of protecting our values and to decide whether to act. These are fundamental questions of humanity, and the government has no right to quash or stifle our parliamentary duty to consider them. The fundamental questions, are we going to bow to the power of China and sort of backroom deals, or are we going to rejoice and empower Britain's greatest gift to the world, robust and unfettered parliamentary debate on the basis of sound evidence to make key decisions and when and whether to put our values for our economic interests? I think we are obliged morally to support this amendment, and I certainly will be.
The last speaker, before I call the Minister, is Paul Howell. We go to Paul Howell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the Base Select Committee, who have recently produced our report on Uyghur forced labour in Xinjiang and UK value chains, I understand the concerns lodged around trading with countries where genocide is suspected to be happening, or in particular where it's felt almost certain it is happening. The supply chains of all companies operating in this space need to either dramatically increase their capability and delivery of transparency, or accept the presumption that they're profiteering from exploitation. It's who determines getting past the key statement of whether genocide is happening in law that this amendment questions, and my belief is that it's quite clear that the place for this determination is in the courts. The government has been consistently clear it's for competent courts, not committees, to make determinations of genocide. I do not believe that it needs a trade agreement discussion to engage actions on concerns as significant as genocide, and I welcome the statement earlier by the Foreign Secretary in taking steps along with our partners where evidence is apparent of actions incompatible with our values. I wholeheartedly support his words. Indeed, I would encourage him to go further. I believe the Neal Amendment meets the concerns raised around parliamentary scrutiny, in that it should be a credible concern of genocide be raised within a country we are proposing a new free trade agreement with. It ensures that a debate and a vote in Parliament will result. Credible reports rather than determination is a lower level of proof for stimulating this intervention, and this is wholly appropriate, as the practical difficulties in proving genocidal intent mean that genocide is very difficult to prove, even when apparently obvious. I'm convinced, I do apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I've gone to the wrong place. I'm convinced of the need for us to ensure that any new free trade agreements should not be made with countries where there is a credible concern of genocide, or indeed of any other significant human rights issues. But I'm not convinced this amendment is the mechanism by which it should be done. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It has been a good but short debate. As my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, said, the amendment from the other place will have significant unintended consequences, creating a so-called parliamentary judicial committee, destabilising the balance of powers between Parliament and judiciary, whilst not actually helping those suffering at the hands of the Chinese authorities or those elsewhere in the world. When it comes to China, the UK is leading action internationally. And as we saw earlier in this House, the Foreign Secretary, who had already announced a series of targeted measures in respect of UK supply chains and trade, and earlier today, with concerted international action with Magnitsky sanctions with 29 of our friends and allies, we will continue to hold China to account for its actions in Xinjiang. But let us not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this trade bill is a hugely important and necessary piece of legislation for the UK economy. The sooner we enact this bill, the sooner importers, exporters and the general public can harness the benefit that this bill brings. But let us not forget, it is the trade bill. It is about trade, and I'm going to return to that in just a second. We heard from the shadow front bench, who spoke. She spoke eloquently about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and I agreed with every word of what she described. However, less than a year ago, Madam Deputy Speaker, she was urging, or seemingly urging us, to do a trade deal with China. From that dispatch box on the 12th of May 2020, she attacked the government for engaging in negotiations with the United States. She said she will not agree measures with the United States, quote, which would constrain the UK's ability to negotiate our own trade agreement with China. Quoted from Hansard. No, it's in Hansard. She shouldn't have said it if she didn't want to say it. So she is opposed to a trade deal with the United States in case it jeopardised a trade deal with China. We heard from my honourable friend, the member for Worthing, who asked, it's difficult to see what position the government would agree with. Well, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we agree with the amendment put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst. We heard from others, what does this do to help the Uyghurs? Well, this is a trade bill. It's mainly about the continuity of previous EU trade agreements and trade defences and trade data. We don't have a free trade agreement with China. We have no plans or intention to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. There is no historic free trade agreement with China. And none of this is even in the range of the bill as was written. But nor is it clear to me, with the Alton Amendment, that there is a significant agreement in scope to cancel. This is a trade bill dealing with free trade agreements. There is no FTA with China. and that is why Xinjiang and the Uyghurs would not be in scope of the trade bill. Instead, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is why the Foreign Secretary and others are taking the tough action that we propose. We heard from the SNP, which was more about the EU, Brexit and Donald Trump than about trade, China or the Uyghurs. My right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Wood Green, and my honourable friend, the member for Wealden, talked passionately about the cause. But the Parliamentary Judicial Committee would be given a new power in law to make a determination of genocide. The government cannot agree with that. Instead, we agree with the approach made by my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, who describes the Parliamentary Judicial Committee as being constitutionally illiterate. The government would facilitate such motions, as he asked, to allow select committees to set up a subcommittee to examine these issues if the Select Committee chose to do that, Madam Deputy Speaker. That is the most important point. I hope that honourable members can now come together to underscore our support for this approach in place of the approach proposed by the other place and pass once more the amendment in the name of the Chair of the Justice Select Committee.
The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Tellers for the ayes, Jeff Smith and Bambos Charalambos. Tellers for the noes, Maria Caulfield and Michael Tomlinson. Lock the doors. Order. Order.
The eyes to the right, 300. The nose to the left, 318.
The eyes to the right, 300. The nose to the left, 318. So the nose have it. The nose have it. Unlock. The question is that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 3E. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. Read it all. The question is that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 3E. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Maria Caulfield and Michael Tomlinson. Tellers for the noes, Jeff Smith and Bambos Charalambos. And this will be a 5-minute interval before the doors are locked.
Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 297.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 297. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Minister to move that a committee be appointed to draw up a reason.
I beg to move that a committee be appointed to draw up a reason to be assigned to the Lords for insisting on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D, and for disagreeing to their Amendment 3E. That Greg Hands, Maria Caulfield, Michael Tomlinson, Emily Thornbury and Drew Hendry be members of the committee. That Greg Hands be the chair of the committee. That 3 be the quorum of the committee. That the committee do withdraw immediately.
The question is that a committee be appointed to draw up a reason to be assigned to the Lords for insistence on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and for disagreeing to their Amendment 3E. That Greg Hands, Maria Caulfield, Michael Tomlinson, Emily Thornbury and Drew Hendry be members of the committee. That Greg Hands be the chair of the committee. That 3 be the quorum of the committee. That the committee do withdraw immediately. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. And 3 no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And in order to observe social distancing, the Reasons Committee will meet in Committee Room 12. Thank you very much. We're not going to suspend because the dispatch boxes have already been sanitised and ready to go. So we now